Hello, friends. Welcome to this session on fiscal policy. Yeah, as a part of the discussion of macroeconomic policy, we are going to discuss today a very important tool of macroeconomic policy, namely the fiscal policy, which is there in the hands of the government of India. Initially, let me try to give you the overview of today's presentation. Today's presentation will be covering initially we will be covering the definition of what a fiscal policy actually means. Then we shall try to see what are the instruments of fiscal policy. And then we shall try to summarize the entire presentation in a nutshell form. So let us first try to pick up directly some of the basic definitions of what exactly the fiscal policy means. There have been a number of authors who have given the definitions of fiscal policy. But among all the definitions, we shall be selecting one or two important ones, which will help us to clarify the concept of fiscal policy. Now, here the first definition says the fiscal policy refers to the government actions affecting its receipts and expenditures. Any government policy or any government action which influences the receipts and expenditure of the government is classified under the fiscal policy. So if the government is trying to increase its taxes, by way of which the tax revenues are increasing. If at all the government decides to spend more on infrastructure, then the government expenditure increases. Both these measures are known as the tools of fiscal policies. Similarly, you have Arthur Smith is defining the fiscal policy as a policy under which the government uses its expenditure and revenue programs to produce the desirable effects and avoid the undesirable effects in the national income, production, and employment. So in the first statement, we have come to know that anything that relates directly to the receipts and expenditure of the government is known as fiscal policy. Now, why at all the government would like to increase its expenditure or try to vary its receipts? Basically because it wants to produce the desirable effects in the economy. Means in the sense it wants to have the desirable effects like increase in national income. It wants to have a desirable effect like increase in production and increase in employment. At the same time, through the fiscal policy and through the variation of its receipts and expenditure programs, the government would also try to avoid what is known as the undesirable effects on the national income aggregates. So it's a powerful tool in the hands of the government in order to produce the desirable effect and avoid the undesirable effect on the national income or all the macroeconomic aggregates. The third important definition is given by Otto Eckstein. As per his perception, changes in taxes and expenditure which aim at short-run goals of full employment and price stability can be classified as the fiscal policy. So here also the main focus is variation in taxation of the country. If, for example, if the taxes in the country are at, let us say, 10%, and now it is being increased to 20%, such kind of a taxes lead to increase in the government revenues. So it is a tool of fiscal policy. Similarly, if the government is trying to decide to spend some more money on infrastructure in our country, that increases the expenditure of the government. So since these are having a direct implication on the taxes and expenditures, they are coming under the category of the fiscal policy. The basic aim of the fiscal policy happens to achieve the full employment. Now, full employment, not just of labor, but the full employment of all the resources. So not only to achieve the full employment, but also the much desired objective of stable prices is again achieved with the help of fiscal policy by the government of India. Now, not only within the country, but all in the world over, you'll be trying to see that this is being used as an important policy to achieve these macroeconomic objectives of all the countries of the world. Now, if at all fiscal policy as a tool has to be used, let us try to understand what are its basic instruments of fiscal policy. What are the tools which are there in the hands of the government, which can be classified as the tools or the instruments of fiscal policy. Now, there are fundamentally three tools. Among them, the first one is the budgetary policy. You may be surprised to see that the budget is a consciously used tool of fiscal policy. It is not just a statement of income and expenditure, but it is trying to achieve the macroeconomic policy objectives. How is it? Let us try to see. For example, the budget deficit. Budget deficit is occurs one expenditure of the expenditure happens to be more than the revenue. In simple words, the expenditure programs are increased and the revenue programs remain the same, and this kind of a policy is taken up during the depression. Budget deficit has an expansionary effect on the aggregate demand. Increase in government expenditure and keep the taxes constant, or decrease in taxes without any change in government expenditure, leads to a budget deficit phenomenon. Now here deficit is definitely a important tool for an economy which is in the developing stage. An economy which happens to be in a developing stage, definitely budget deficit as a tool in order to revive the economic activity. Now, this has been the tool which the government has been employing ever since we are coming or trying to come out of the situation of pandemic. So, budget deficit. So, budget deficit is not to be, we can say, taken in a negative form for an economy. When an economy is in an underdeveloped situation or when it is in a developing situations, the government of that particular nations definitely incur deficit budget. Similarly, surplus budget. Surplus budget occurs when the revenues of the governments are much higher than the expenditures. Now, such kind of a surplus budget policy can be followed when there is a situation of boom. Boom in the sense when there is a prosperity. National income increases, private expenditure, private investment increases, production increases. At that particular point of time, there is no need for the government to increase its own expenditure. So at that time, government depends upon the initiatives of the private enterprise only for revival of the economic activity or for the prosperity in the economy. So when the economy is working well on its own, there is no need for the government to increase its expenditure, so it keeps it constant. So how does it achieve the surplus budget? Surplus budget is achieved either through increase in taxation or through the reduction in government expenditure, or both. Means you increase the taxation, increase the taxation, so revenue increase. Keep the government expenditure constant, or for example, reduction in government expenditure, or both. This policy is followed to control inflationary pressures in the economy. As we have noted earlier, one of the important objective of fiscal policy happens to be stability in prices in the entire country. And this stability in prices can be achieved when the government keeps its expenditure program at a low level, or it reduces and increases its revenue by way of increase in taxation. So when taxations are increased, the purchasing power decreases. When purchasing power decreases, the demand decreases, and as a result, that will have a downward pressure on prices. So these are the two important tools under budgetary policy, that is budget deficit and surplus, and the surplus budget. Similarly, balanced budget is again a consciously followed tool. When the increase in taxes and increase in government expenditure are one and the same, then we call it as a balanced budget. Now, balanced budget is also having an expansionary effect in the economy. Expansionary effect in the sense, balanced budget will lead to increase in national income and increase in employment, and what I can say, increase in production also. Why is it? Because the effect of increase in expenditure will be higher than the effect of increase in taxes. So budgetary policy happens to be an important tool in the hands of the government in order to have desirable effects in the economy and avoid undesirable effects. The second particular tool which is there under the fiscal policy happens to be the compensatory fiscal policy. Compensatory fiscal policy, again, you have three particular subcategories in this. What are those? Built-in flexibility, formula flexibility, and discretionary action. Now, the words which are there, they themselves clarify what are these particular concepts. For example, built-in flexibility. Built-in flexibility means automatic adjustment is there within the budget itself. Within the budget itself, there are some mechanism introduced so that automatically it leads to variation in government expenditure and variation in the tax revenues. Such kind of an automatic adjustment, which is mentioned, which is given within the budget itself, is known as built-in flexibility. For example, the income tax rates, which is called as progressive income tax rates. Like for example, lower income group 10%, middle income group 20%, higher income group 30%. So now this kind of a progressive income tax is there for our country. Okay, when the economy is moving up, automatically people prosper from lower income group to middle, middle to higher, and automatically the government revenue also starts increasing. So you might be seeing that the progressive income tax is a tool of fiscal policy under the category of built-in flexibility. Under this case, again, if an economy is going down, an economy is declining, it means the income level of the peoples are decreasing. Means there is a movement of people from higher income group to middle and from middle to lower, which has been the case during this pandemic time period. Then automatically the tax rates also, tax collections also fall from 30% to 20%. The government revenue also automatically decreases. Such kind of an automatic adjustment which is there within the budget is called as built-in flexibility. There is formula flexibility also. Formula flexibility in the sense tax rates and government expenditures are changed in relation to some indexes such as prices, industrial or employment index. If employment index or industrial index are going up constantly, there is auto percentage proportionately the government expenditure is reduced. If industrial index or employment index are going down, then definitely automatically there will be an increase in government expenditure. Such kind of a variation in government expenditure based on some in relation to some index is known as formula flexibility. Now, this is a very powerful tool in controlling businesses upswings and downswings. Whenever the economy is prospering well or whenever the economy is declining, at that time you find that formula flexibility happens to be an important tool. Similarly, there is a tool called as a discretionary action. Discretionary actions in the sense government deliberately tries to do the variation in the tax rates as well as the government expenditure. So there are three ways: either to change the tax, keep the government expenditure constant. Secondly, change government expenditure and keep the tax constant. The second way in which discretionary it uses its own judgment, what will be good for the economy and what will not be good for the economy, and based on that it decides to keep the government expenditure constant and change government expenditure and keep the tax constant, or change both the taxation and the government expenditure. So this depends upon the perception. This depends upon what we call it as the assessment of the government, about the performance of the economy. Based on this, it decides to use either discretionary action, formula flexibility, or built-in flexibility. So after the budgetary policy, this happens to be an important tool called as compensatory fiscal policy. And this we have built-in, formula, and discretionary action. The third and the last category of tool or instrument of fiscal policy happens to be the public expenditure. Public expenditure, and under this you have two categories, namely compensatory spending and pump priming. Compensatory spending, in the sense it is taken up in order to compensate for the declining private investment. For example, government tries to monitor the investments which are made by private sector in the various sectors of the economy. So in some critical sector, if private investment is not coming forward and the government feels that it is an important one, then the government comes forward and takes up that particular investment, and that is called as compensatory spending. In the sense, it is trying to compensate for the shortfall which is there from the private sector. So expenditure on public works, relief measures, etc. are all the example of the public expenditure. Similarly, pump priming. Pump priming in a sense, the moderate use of public expenditure temporarily to kickstart the economic activity. In simple words, what does it say is that the economy sometimes we can say enters into a stagnant position in spite of the best of the effort. At that time, the government tries to put a small doses of investment in the economy so that the economy kickstarts. And once the economy restarts, automatically you'll find that the government again removes or reduces its expenditure. So this is, in simple words, the three categories of the tools of public expenditure, we can say the fiscal policy. And in summary, we can conclude that fiscal policy is a powerful tool of economic stabilization. Though through this policy, the government can offset undesirable variation in private consumption expenditure and investment by changes in public expenditure and taxes. Though the ultimate aim of fiscal policy is the long-run stabilization of the economy, it can be achieved by moderating short-term fluctuations. So the control over the macroeconomic variables can be had with the help of the instruments of fiscal policy, and these variables can be guided in the desirable direction through the instruments of fiscal policy, and the undesirable variation in these particular direction in these variables can also be changed with the help of the tools of fiscal policy. So thank you very much for we can say attending this particular session. I hope this will be helping you to clarify the basic concepts of the fiscal policy.